Hi, this is Tamara from mooglyblog.com, and I'm so excited to be part of the JOANN Stitch Along. I'm going to be demonstrating how to take one ball of Bernat blanket extra thick plus an 18-inch pillow form and use our hands to make the Bernat blanket extra thick table knit round pillow. Check this out. It's so cozy and squishy. And again, all we're going to need is our fingers and the yarn. So let's go ahead and get started.
So here's another look at that yarn. We need just one skein of Bernat blanket extra thick to make this round pillow. Since we're using our hands, there's no needles needed, but you will of course need a pair of scissors. And here's a closer look at that pillow. Let me set these aside here. You're going to make two pieces, a front and a back. Then we'll join them together around the sides. But of course, to fill it up, you'll also need a pillow form. So it's an 18-inch pillow. They recommend an 18-inch pillow form, but if you like your pillows a little fluffier, you can try and stuff it with a 20-inch pillow form. Now let's go ahead and get started making our first piece for our Bernat blanket extra thick table knit round pillow. So again, we're going to be making two pieces exactly alike, so they both start with a slip knot. We're going to come in 10 inches or so at least with this yarn. Since it's so big and thick, we'll use up a lot of that tail end as we're making our slip knot. So when you've got the point where you want to put your slip knot, we make a big loop with the yarn like this. Make sure again we've pulled out enough tail here. There we go. Then you can simply slip that tail right under that loop. Reach into that loop with your fingers and grab that little section right there. And then at the same time, pull down on the yarn attached to the skein and the tail of our yarn. If you pull gently on both those sides and up on that loop, we've formed a slip knot. If you don't like your slip knot, you can just pull on those ends and it'll pop right back out. Now we want this slip knot to be big enough to get about 2 fingers easily through. We're going to be using our fingers to pull loops through loops. So we need to make sure those loops are about 2 inches big, or as I say, big enough to get your personal fingers through. Everybody's got slightly different sized hands. After we've got that slip knot made, we're ready to begin round 1. So we're going to need to pull up some loops through this slip knot to start round 1. Using your pointer finger and thumb, we're going to grab our working yarn, which is the end attached to the skein, and pull that loop up about 2 inches. There we are. Again, about the same size loop, about the right size, just to get your forefinger and thumb through. Then we're going to pull the working yarn from front to back through that same loop to create a second stitch. Since we're knitting, we need to get some live loops here. So we've got our first one here, but to pull up our next one, we're going to go from front to back right through that first slip knot we made, just like that. And I like to give this a little extra tug just to get it so that it stays nice and upright there. And again, we want it to be the right size to get our thumb and forefinger through. Then we need a third stitch. So now we're going to come from the back again. I'm just going to turn that loop right around. And now I'm going to come from behind and pull that third loop up and through. And I like to hold on to those first two I've made with my other hand, just so I don't accidentally pull them back out when I'm pulling up a new one. And now we have 3 loops made. This is the most recent one I made, and this is our first one. This pattern recommends that you always mark the first stitch, and it puts the instruction for that at the end of each row, but I'm going to recommend that you make sure and move that up at the beginning of each row. This is the kind of stitch marker that I like to use. It's actually a crochet stitch marker, but it's nice and big to get around this yarn. But you can use whatever stitch marker you have, or even a safety pin, or a paper clip, or a bit of scrap yarn. Now, this is table knitting, so at the end of each round, I really like to lay it out right on the table in front of me and make sure all my loops are even and that they're all pulled out nicely where I can find them. Just like regular knitting, it's easy to lose those loops since we don't have a needle going through them. It's always important to just take our time and make sure all our loops are pulled up nice and even. Then we're ready to begin round 2. So we're going to start again in that first loop, which is why we have it marked, and we're going to go ahead and pull up a stitch. Same thing, we're going to come from behind and pull up 1 loop through that stitch about 2 inches tall. Now, since that's the new first stitch of the round, it's a good time to go ahead and move that stitch marker right on up to that loop we've just made. There we go. Then we want to pull another stitch up through this loop. So we're going to do the same thing we did before. We come from the front of that loop, and that allows us to pull another loop through. That creates a little bit of a hump right there. So I like to just give those 2 stitches a little tug to pull that down a little bit tighter. If you find that you've pulled your loop up way too high, you can just pull back down on that working yarn until you've got the right size made. So now we've made 2 stitches in that first stitch. We can lay it out on the table again to make sure we're going the right direction. Come to the second stitch and we'll do the same thing. We come from behind to pull up our first loop, about 2 inches tall there. And then we come from the front to push through our second loop. There we are. And again, we just want to take our time, give those a little tug if needed, and get those about the same size. Then we can lay those out, make sure all our loops are pulled up nice and high. We've got 2 loops for the first stitch, 2 loops for the second stitch. So we come over here to our third stitch and do the same thing one more time. Pull a loop up from behind, and then pull a loop through from the front. There we go. Make sure those are about the same size. And then we can lay out our loops again to make sure that they lay out really nicely. Let's get that little tail out of the way there. And again, I just like to give all of those a little tug and make sure they're all about the same size. We can see there's our first marked stitch. So we should have 6 stitches total. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. There we go. And with that, we're done with round 2 and ready for round 3. So in round 3, we're going to turn these 6 stitches into 12 stitches, which means increasing in every stitch again. So we find our first stitch there with our stitch marker and pull our loop up from behind. And then, of course, don't forget to move that stitch marker on up to your new first loop of the round. Then we're going to go ahead and push through our second loop from the front. There we are, until it's about the same size as well. Then you want to just very carefully, and if you need to sort of lay it out, and that helps you find those stitches, we want to make sure that we don't lose any of those stitches behind our work. So we find our next one right here. Going to carefully pull our yarn to the back again, and do it again. Pull a stitch up from the back, and another stitch from the front. Pull those out, lay them out nicely with the other 2, and we're 2 stitches in. Find the next stitch, pull from the back, kind of secure that again while we pull from the front. And we get 2 loops again through that stitch. Carefully turn it over here. We find the next stitch, make sure we're not losing any of those behind. That's where they like to hide. Pull the yarn to the back again so we can come from the back. And then again from the front. There we go. Give that a little bit of a tug. This chenille yarn has a lot of texture, so it likes to grab onto itself, so you need to use a little bit of hand strength. Then we can carefully keep turning here. Find our next loop here. Make sure those aren't accidentally pulling through on the previous row. It's important to come back and give those a little tug here every once in a while. There's our stitches there. So now we come from the front, or excuse me, from the back, and then from the front. There we are. And then we should have one more stitch here. That last one wants to try and hide. Don't let it disappear. Come from the back. And again from the front. There we are. And now we should have a total of 12 stitches. We just need to get those sort of straightened out for us here on our table. There's our tail, our working end. So we've got 1, there's our marked stitch, 2, 3, 4. Again, I like just to give those a little extra tug. 5 and 6, 7 and 8, 9 and 10. Get those sort of straightened out here. There we are. And then finally, 11 and 12. And with that, we're finished with round 3 and ready to start round 4. Now, round 4 is going to be a little different. Instead of increasing in every stitch, we're just going to increase in every other stitch, starting with our first stitch, then our third stitch, fifth stitch, seventh stitch, etc. So let's come back here to our first stitch, and we're going to increase there. So we'll get our yarn in the back there and pull up our first loop and move up our stitch marker. There we go. And then I'm going to come from the front and push through that second loop. So we've got our first 2 stitches for round 4. Then we've got this one back here. And this guy is just going to get 1 stitch. So we put 2 stitches in the first stitch, 1 stitch in the second stitch. We come around, now we've got our 3rd stitch, so we're going to increase again. 1 from the back, and 1 from the front. There we are. Next stitch only gets 1. Next stitch gets 2. 1 from the back, and 1 from the front. There we are. Give those a little tug there. Always make sure those loops aren't getting lost. Keep turning, get that little tail end out of the way there. Find our next stitch. So we can come from the back there and come from the front, or excuse me, come from the back for a loop and then come from the front for a loop. Got our next increase there. So then the next stitch does not get an increase. And we just continue doing that all the way around. 2, then 1, 2, then 1, until at the end of round 4, you should have a total of 18 stitches made. Again, at the end of your round, make sure you lay it all out and count out your loops and make sure you haven't missed any. Then we can go ahead and begin round 5. For round 5, we start in our first stitch as usual, and this time we're going to increase in our first stitch. So we pull up our first loop, move up that stitch marker, and then pull through from the front. There we are. Give those a little tug. Then we simply 1 stitch in each of the next 2 stitches. 1 stitch, 1 stitch. And that is our repeat that takes us all the way around round 5. 2 stitches in the first stitch, 1 stitch, 1 stitch. Continue that all the way around until you have a total of 24 stitches made. So now all that's left for our first side are rounds 6 and 7, and 6 and 7 are exactly the same. We're going to be working even, so we're going to keep 24 stitches in each round. So that means we come up to that first stitch there. We've got our first marked stitch. We're going to go ahead and pull that first loop through, move up that stitch marker again. Otherwise, it's really easy to lose your place. There we go. And then we just go and find each stitch around and pull up 1 loop. So we're working even 1 stitch in each stitch all the way around for a total of 24 stitches in rounds 6 and 7. So after you have finished rounds 6 and 7, it's time to go ahead and cut your yarn. But we want to go ahead and leave another 10 inches or so just to make sure our end doesn't fall out. So then you do the exact same thing to make your second piece, and then it's time to assemble your pillow. Okay, so now we're ready to assemble our pillow. We're going to turn one of our pieces over so that it's wrong side up and put the other piece right on top. This way, the right side, the side that's been facing us as we work, will be on the outside on both sides of our pillow. Then what I like to do is find the first stitch of each piece and line those up together. Should be near those tails. There we are. Let's see. Where did it go? There it is. Alrighty. Now it's all lined up. So what we're going to do now is we're going to work our way around the outside, pushing the top layer loop through the corresponding back layer loop. So we want to go ahead and pull that through nice and high. Then we just come over here, find that next loop from behind, the next loop from the front, there we go, and push that front loop right through the back loop. Same, find that back loop that's next, find our front loop that's next, and push the front loop right through the back loop. Now this is sort of the same thing. These loops are still live, so we still want to go ahead and give those a tug every once in a while to make sure that our pillow isn't coming apart. So you simply continue to do this all the way around until you get till there's about a foot left, and then you can insert your pillow before you pull through that last loop. Now our pillow is starting to come together. We have just 24 loops left, and the front and the back are nice and secured. Again, make sure you get that pillow form in there before you pull together those last few loops. Now I've also made sure, as I've pulled through those loops, that one of my tails is still hanging out right here. I'm going to use this to secure the very final loop here as we bind off. So now it's time to begin that bind off. So as we begin our bind off, I'm actually going to go ahead and just tuck that little tail end behind. And now I'm going to start with the stitch to the left of our first stitch. I still have this one marked that I pulled through. So starting here at the left, we've got our first stitch and our second stitch. I'm going to pull the second stitch right through the first stitch. And I want to give that a nice strong tug. There we are. Then we're going to do the same thing here. Just simply pull that second stitch right through the first stitch. Continue doing this all the way around until it's bound off all the way around. Then when we get to that last loop, we'll use our tail end to secure it down. I now have gone all the way around and our last loop has been pulled through. So I'm going to go ahead and remove that stitch marker one last time and take our cut tail end and send that right through that final stitch. Then I can weave that into the rest of our pillow and we're all done with our Bernat Blanket Extra Thick Table Knit Round Pillow. Here you can see it finished in all its glory and ready for cuddling. I hope you enjoy making your own with Bernat Blanket Extra Thick.